You know, uh, we're going to make this pretty personal, and we're going to try to humanize Hank Beechel because a lot of you probably think of Hank Beechel as this sort of glorious man, which of course he is, but he's also very human. And I have a sort of a personal connection to both Norm and to Hank in that when I was about your age, graduated in 1969. There was a book called The Population Bomb, and it said that we were going to have massive starvation, and there was nothing we could do about it. We were going to have literally hundreds of millions of people die in the 70s, all from starvation. And it never came true. And the reason why it never came true, and it looks like the sound just picked up. Is that a little loud? How are we doing on the sound? Okay. Is that better? Can you hear me? Okay. So the reason why they never came true was because of the Green Revolution. And so when I was a high school student and I was interested in feeding people, it was because of Norm and Hank that I entered agriculture. And it's pretty strange for a city boy that grew up within 5 miles of O'Hare Airport, went to a school in Boston, then came back and went to a school in Indiana to make his career in agriculture, and I wouldn't change a thing for it. So I want to give you a little history because one of the things that Hank did that was really cool, it's two things really, among other things, but one is he loved students. So this luncheon really is for the students here that are part of this group, because I guarantee you Hank would come back to the University of Nebraska and he'd meet with the faculty and then he'd say, I got to go see the agronomy club, or I've got to go see the students. And he'd always be clustered by students. And if you wonder why, it's because both Norm and Hank knew that the revolutionaries, the people who were really going to change the world, were not those of us that may be set in our ways already. It was the people that you could still shape, you could still form. And so he always wanted to meet with students. Now, Hank never had any children of his own, okay? That was unfortunate. But he took his wealth at the end of his life and donated it to scholarships for students, among other things, because he always knew that the next generation would have to make a difference, same way as he did. Now, to give you a little story about Hank, and I guess what I love is that, obviously this is a giant oak tree that grew from an acorn, okay? But just to put it in perspective, he got his degree from the University of Nebraska. He went off to school, okay? And his father, and to this day I'll never know if this was reverse psychology or not, looked at Hank and said, well, I sure hope you enjoy college. I'll see you back in 2 weeks. He actually thought Hank would last 2 weeks in college and then be back at the farm, okay? And I think that motivated Hank in a manner that he was not going to fail because he wasn't going to have his father tell him, welcome back to the farm. Now, he loved farming, don't get me wrong. But that was sort of Hank. He grew up in a small town, Waverly, Nebraska, just north of here. The farm moved to Perkins County, and then they eventually, in the middle of the Dust Bowl and the Depression, they lost the farm. But he always had a feeling of he wanted to change things. He actually wanted to be a wheat breeder, and opportunity didn't work out that way. They needed rice breeders. So he worked 30 years for the USDA. And then in 1960, he decided to retire from the USDA. And at that time, the International Rice Research Institute was just forming, okay? That's the first of the great international centers. It actually predates CIMMYT, and CIMMYT is based in part because the ambassador, the president of Mexico, met the Secretary of State of the Philippines and wondered what they should do with the Rockefeller Foundation at Mexico. What would its next role be? And he said, well, you should go take a look at what they're doing with Erie. And I happen to be on the board of trustees for Erie, so I know the legacy that Hank built there. What he did was, most of us know the story of Norm Borlaug because wheat is more important in the U.S. Hank was the Norm Borlaug of rice. In 1961, when they started the Erie Rice Center, okay, he was the first breeder hired. They had a fellow by the name of Peter Jennings. They had a fellow by the name of T.T. Chang. T.T. Chang collected germplasm from all around the world. Peter Jennings made the first crosses, and Hank Beechel made all the selections. And so Hank was a person who basically released the first great mega rice, one called IR8. And it changed the world in the rice producing area. That'd be Southeast Asia, now parts of Africa, parts of South America, but mainly Southeast Asia. Completely changed it from subsistence farming to where people could make a living, could survive, could feed their own families. Basically, what Hank did for rice is what Norm did for wheat, or we should put it in the opposite because Norm did it first. Okay? Now, if you are lucky enough, you will see, if you know your history, you will see a photo of Hank Beecher showing IR8. Over one shoulder is President Lyndon Baines Johnson, and over the other shoulder is President Ferdinand Marcos. Okay? Now, for those who are unfamiliar, in the late 60s and early 70s, there was a war going on called the Vietnam War. Ferdinand Marcos and LBJ were major proponents of that war, major allies. They were probably talking in the Philippines about how to affect that war, but LBJ was a farmer, okay, and he understood agriculture. And so in the midst of this war, they stopped. They went to the Philippine Center to see the new magic rice that was being developed. And so one of the great pictures of all time is Hank Beecher with the President of the United States over one shoulder, the President of the Philippines over the other, because he was doing something which made sense, that would help pacify and feed the world so no longer would hunger ever be that. So that's kind of the story of Hank, a student that came from Nebraska. You know, I think his father had maybe not as high expectations as Hank eventually proved him wrong. He loved students, loved them dearly, because he always felt you were the ones that were going to shape the future you want to have. He went on to do things that are absolutely amazing. You know, IR8 is still a rice that's hard to beat. It's absolutely spectacular. If you ever get the chance to be in the Philippines, you should see the International Rice Research Center. It's magnificent. Any of the CG centers are basically magnificent. They have saved the lives of literally billions of people. And the lives they didn't save, they've made better because they now are wealthier. And all of that Hank wanted to do was just to give back. Okay? So he retired from the USDA, worked 10 more years at the International Rice Research Institute. He then was mandated to retire because he reached their mandatory retirement age, and he worked 10 more years in Indonesia. And then he lived to be 100, and he was a consultant for the first hybrid rice company in the U.S. and became one of the very strong proponents of rice here. With that, I'll probably stop. Are there any questions you might have? And remember, Hank would always want a question from a student. Not to put you on the spot, but he always would. Yes? Hunger is the most solvable problem that faces humanity. It is truly solvable. What's lacking is the will. And so you could feed everybody today. We have enough food. We just don't decide as a country, as a globe, to do that. So hunger is the most solvable problem you can have. And what Hank would want you to do is to remember your life in context. And that is, you're going to help someone else. You start with food. And so his legacy and the legacy of Norm Borlaug will be feeding people. And, you know, Norm made a comment once, which is the Green Revolution would buy us time. He said the improvements that they made in wheat and now in rice would give us 30 years, and then we'd be right back where we started. He was wrong. It took us 40 years. But now you begin to hear about food insecurity. It's because we need the second Green Revolution. And so what Hank and what Norm would want you to do in their legacy is to continue the vision that hunger is unacceptable in a civilized world, and that we have the wherewithal to solve it, and we will. And that's what the part that always is amazing to me is that people consider starvation an acceptable loss. Hank never would have accepted that. Norm never would have accepted that. And I don't think anyone who really cares about humanity can accept it. That would be his legacy. One last question then, because I got my good buddies coming up next. He's been a better speaker than I am. Yes? Pardon me? So the question was, for those who didn't hear it, did Hank ever work with the food distribution system as opposed to just trying to work on the production side? The answer was that Hank worked with a global enterprise, the International Rice Research Institute, and before that the USDA, and after that the government in Indonesia. His role was always to work on production, always to provide the types of varieties which could feed the world. He was not a specialist on the economics and the marketing. But his goal is like so many others, which is that whenever humanity decides we want to feed people, it's best if you have the resources that you could feed them. So he made sure that the production answers were there in hopes that others would make sure that it would be distributed. So he always worked in the side that he was skilled in. He was a highly skilled plant breeder. Okay, with that, thank you very much.